Hi everybody, my name's Chris Oliver and I'm Chief Executive at Lancashire and South Cumbria Foundation Trust. And today is episode 2 of In Conversation with a CEO, the podcast which is all about going behind the scenes of a large NHS trust and delving deeper into some of the services that we provide and raising awareness of particular conditions. In today's episode, we're covering autism, and I'm really pleased to be able to introduce to you our guest, Joe Heathcote, who is a community nurse in our specialist autism team. So hi Joe.
Hello.
Can you tell me a bit about your job and how long you've worked for the Trust?
Well, I've worked for the Trust for, it's nearly 7 years now. But in terms of my job with the autism team, it's been just about 4 or 5 months. I transferred over because having worked for the LD team, I could see that there's historically been a massive gap in service in terms of supporting people with the diagnosis of autism and no learning disability. So it seemed a chance to sort of get in on the ground floor with a brand new service and try and really provide a lot of good quality input for people who've traditionally found it very difficult to access services unless they've been in crisis.
That's really, really good. Cheers. Thanks, Joe. And I believe that the name of the teams has changed recently?
Yes, we were the Autism Outreach Team. We will soon, if not already, be the Specialist Autism Team. And that's to cover the fact that we are starting to develop a sort of inpatient consultation offer to try and support people who are within the inpatient settings to get back into the community in the shortest time frame possible.
Fantastic. And so who can access the Specialist Autism Team?
So definitely at the moment we are still just an adjunct to the mental health services. So somebody would need to be above the age of 16. So we do cover that transition sort of age, which is really important because that can be one of the key sort of stresses in an autistic person's life, going from that sort of expectations in childhood to adulthood. They have to either have a diagnosis of autism or be on the pathway. So if somebody's had an autistic quotient 10 screening tool done and that's indicated, that will be enough for us to be able to work with them. With the understanding that the assessment process will be ongoing while we were working alongside, and they need to be at risk of hospital admission, so open to the home treatment teams at that point, or if it's an inpatient, to be within an inpatient service.
Fantastic. And so what type of roles make up the Specialist Autism Team?
Well, we're quite lucky that we have pretty much an entire MDT. So being as how social communication is such a big part of diagnosing autism, we do have access to speech and language therapy. We have OTs in the team looking at functional assessments. And because of the issues historically of diagnostic overshadowing, the nursing element is really important in terms of looking for underlying health conditions that may be being missed because people are putting it down to either the mental health presentation or the diagnosis of autism.
That's really interesting. And so you touched on it slightly, but what is the service remit of the team? So it's around supporting patients when they're
at crisis. So it's about reducing risk. We have access to a brilliant psychologist, Andrea Flood, and she sort of mentors the team around that risk reduction strategies. But the ultimate goal is to prevent that hospital admission if at all possible, and to have either introduce new systems, new ways of working, new information for the person, their family, whoever's supporting them, so that those risks remain lower, so that person can continue to live and thrive in the community without a future mental health crisis on the horizon.
Brilliant, thanks. And so is autism different in adults and children?
No, is the short answer. But the reason that people might think that is because it's about how that person has learnt to mask, how that person has learnt to cope with the bits of the world that are more stressful for them. So when you say that somebody who is a child and might use stimming behaviours as a way of self-regulating, and then you might see that child stops using those stimming behaviours as they go through the school system. A lot of the times, if you talk to that person, it's not because they don't still benefit from stimming and the comfort that gives them and the sense that gives them. It's because they've realised that socially it's unacceptable. That they've realised there's a social rule that if you do that, people are going to call you strange, or are going to ask you why you're doing that. So you will find that people will suppress some of those things in order to try and fit in with a more neurotypical world.
Really interesting. And so what would be some of the examples, Joe, of some of the stimulus that would affect an autistic person?
Again, it's the same as a neurotypical person across all the sensory systems. It's just about the tolerances that person might have. So, for example, in terms of the auditory system, let's say, it may be that an autistic person has difficulty in telling the difference, differentiating between noises in the foreground and noises in the background, and they may struggle to filter those background noises. So if I lived in a house with a train track behind it, after a while, I won't notice it anymore. For a person, who's autistic and who has auditory sensitivities, that may never go away, and it may always be a trigger for them and something that is going to cause a stress. And it can be the same across a range of different sensory systems.
Wow, brilliant. And how important is language when we talk about autism?
I think it's very important because historically it's been very medicalized. The term a person with autism, we all slip up sometimes, but we try not to use that because it's sort of it's taking something that is an intrinsic part of a person and talking about it like it's it's something that needs to be considered outside of. So here's the person, here's their autism, they're two separate things. So we try to always refer autistic person, and that's because, conversations with the autistic community, this is what they've said that they prefer. Although the best piece of advice for anyone working with an autistic person is to ask them, how do they prefer it to be referenced? What phrases do they prefer to use? Because ultimately it's about, building up a meaningful relationship with the person that you're working with. And the best way to do that is to validate their own view.
I suppose that comes back to that whole person-centered approach. And so when I've been out meeting some of the teams and talking about autism, we talk about there being a spectrum in relation to autism. So could you just explain what that means?
Well, unlike a lot of conditions that we sort of support, so coming from an LD background, if you look at, say, Down syndrome, we know there's a genetic marker we can point to and say, either you have it or you don't. It's very binary. Autism is a range of almost symptomologies that we see. So you have trouble with social interaction to a degree that it's impacting upon, your day-to-day living. You have rituals and routines and fixed behaviors or, fixed interests that may impact on your day-to-day routine. And people can sit along a massively ranging sort of spectrum for that. And also the discussion about where you meet the thresholds and not. It's very much down to the interpretation of the assessor at that time and their knowledge and their expertise in order to make that diagnosis, rather than being able to point to a blood test or, a genetic test to say, well, this person is autistic and this person is not.
Fab. And some of the statistics show that autistic people are more at risk to experience a significant mental health problem. Do you know why that would be the case?
I mean, from my own personal understanding and my experience of working with autistic people, I push back a little bit and I'd say that it is the fact that they are being forced still really to live in a world that's set up for neurotypical people.
Yeah.
So in terms of just day-to-day activities, things will be more stressful. And the more stress that you're placed under, the more likely you are to develop a mental health issue down the line. So I think it's skewed because an autistic person is likely to, just by trying to negotiate the same stresses that everybody else does, unless that support's put in there, it's going to be a higher level of stress. So more people are going to reach that threshold where it becomes unbearable and a mental health condition manifests itself. It's been noted because 2009, I think, the Autism Act, it was the first time there was an act of parliament around a specific condition. And when they went back to look at it a decade later, I think they've refreshed it in the early 2000s, early 2020s as well, they're saying that not a lot of actions actually occurred. We're still not quite getting there in terms of what reasonable adjustments are and what the expectations are for us.
Brilliant. And those reasonable adjustments, I'm thinking of as us as an employer?
Mm.
How can we support people within our employment?
It's listening. I mean, we have people within our team who have a diagnosis and are autistic, and it's about listening to what they're saying that they need in order to be able to self-regulate. So I think there's been a lot of stereotyping historically about what autism looks like, what autism is, and luckily there's a lot of media coming out recently that kind of challenges those perceptions. But a person is just as likely to be hyposensitive as they are to be hypersensitive. So the idea of trying to create a low stim environment might work for one person, it won't work for another. There's no silver bullet that is, this is how you make a space right for an autistic person. You can make a space right for an autistic person working alongside them. And I think it's getting that understanding that it really is sort of that
individual.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joe. And we know from the first podcast we did that the reach was significant. We had loads of listeners. So if any of our listeners that are listening into this podcast suspect that they or a loved one might be autistic and wish to find out some more support, what can they do?
Well, this, I think I mentioned before we started, it hits quite close to home for me because this is a process that my wife is going through as we speak. She's just at the start of this process. And it took a year from it being suggested by a medical professional that she might be autistic and that it would be worth pursuing the assessment process, to her deciding that she wanted to actually go through with it. And I think what I've learned from that is the most important thing is to be supportive of the family member, the person who is suspecting that they might be autistic, to point them in the direction of some good information. So the NHS website does have a list of potential signs that you may have undiagnosed autism and that you may have made it to adulthood without anyone picking up on it. There's always the National Autistic Society. They can provide a lot of information. We direct people to a site called Autisticality, which is run by a gentleman who is autistic, and it's written in very sort of simple, easy to access language, giving a load of breakdowns of different things that autistic people might experience. But at the end of the day, I think it's going at the pace of the person, providing that support, but not being someone who's putting pressure on saying, well, we need to know one way or the other. Because taking it from my experience with my wife, even just having that sort of opened up to us that, oh, that's a possibility. Yeah. She felt a lot more able to talk to me about her experiences. And we've put in place a lot of adjustments in order to manage those times when she does feel stressed or she does feel overwhelmed. So even having those conversations and coming up with solutions, you don't always need a label to be able to, tailor something more effectively to a person. If that person wants that diagnosis, they want to be sure, that's a good thing. But so long as you're working in a person-centered way, as you will with anyone, it can really be beneficial.
That's fantastic, Joe. And thank you for sharing that story about your wife. I think
I did ask for permission. I will point that
out. And there's been a lot of awareness in the media recently about autism. And last week was Autism Acceptance Week. What have been the main messages you feel that have come out from these awareness programs, and how do they help?
I think the most important thing is the change to acceptance, because it used to be Autism Awareness Week. And the idea now is that the community have said, look, you've had long enough to be aware of autism. Now you've got to actually start accepting that this is who we are and that this isn't it isn't a medicalized condition. It's not seen that way anymore. It's not something that you're going to change. It's not something that you're going to cure. It's something that you will have to learn to live with. And one of the really interesting things about it is that actually, in many ways, having a diagnosis of autism and seeing the world in that way can be beneficial in a whole range of different areas. Looking at communication, actually, two autistic people communicating will have much better quality of communication than two neurotypical people, because they're not relying on, body language. They're not relying on people understanding what you mean, unsaid, sort of ambiguous phrases. It's very clear. Let's get the information across. So in some ways, actually, it's us that are as neurotypicals that have the deficit,
Yeah.
and that we should actually be looking to our neurodiverse colleagues as a better way of communicating.
I really like that, Joe. That's a good challenge to us all. Good reflection. So thanks very much for joining today's podcast. It's been really informative and insightful to hear. I hope our listeners have really enjoyed today's conversation, and we will be showcasing more around what Lancashire and South Cumbria Foundation Trust does in our third podcast coming to you shortly. Take care.